Hey everyone, welcome to the crew. I'm the Sea Lord, also known as Joseph, and this is the History of the World. This is what I'm calling Episode 0, the History of the World Before Humanity, and it is undoubtedly the furthest thing this channel will ever cover from my actual area of expertise. Frankly, every bit of this episode is actually archaeology or astronomy, and not history. But I felt it had to be done to put things into perspective and set the stage for the first human-focused episode. That said, if you care mostly about actual history, feel free to skip this episode and go straight to the first human episode, aka Episode 1, which will be live 6 hours after this one, starting in the year 4000 before Common Era. Otherwise, grab some snacks and get ready for the first 99.99% of the history of the world. 14 billion years ago. In the beginning, there was nothing. Probably. Observation of this period is totally impossible. If there was anything, it'll never be known. Our knowledge of anything begins with the Big Bang, roughly 13.799 plus or minus 0.021 billion, that's with a B, years ago. For unknown, likely unknowable reasons, the Big Bang occurs. All the matter in the universe erupts from a fixed point, far smaller than an atom, and begins rapidly expanding. Things are initially very, very weird. A lot of physical laws that we take for granted now are a touch wonky with such an enormously hot, dense concentration of mass. This image is terrible, by the way, but no one in any publicly available image seems to be able to keep from drawing stars and galaxies all over the place in Big Bang images, even though there were no stars and galaxies by obvious definition yet. In any case, however, that matter begins to spread out at an incredible rate. Within a mere 200 million years or so, gravity starts to draw pockets of that matter, mainly basic hydrogen atoms, back together again, and this creates the first stars. Now, these first stars, of course, are short-lived affairs, pretty much all hydrogen-helium, no heavy metals, but they do begin to create the first heavier elements inside their cores. Now, it takes another 200 million years or so, but these stars coalesce into the first galaxies. They are pulled together by gravity, even as the force of the initial Big Bang and perhaps the mysterious, unexplained dark matter, which I will not even attempt, continues to hurl them in all directions. Now, over the next few 100 million years, these galaxies become increasingly complex, and just about 13 billion years ago, give or take a couple 100 million years, the galaxy we know as the Milky Way begins to take shape, centered around the black hole Sagittarius A*. Now, whether the black holes at the center of not just our galaxy, but a lot of others, are a cause or an effect for said galaxies is, so far as I can tell, still unclear. That being said, let's fast forward 4 billion years or so. Stars are born. Stars die. Billions of stars are born and die. A bit faster than they tend to today. They're mostly just hydrogen still, only a few heavier elements. They don't last as long. It's only about 8.8 billion years ago that the first of the stars of what we would call the third generation, population 1, begin to come into existence. These stars are rich in heavy metals produced by other stars that have already died, and last a lot longer than their forebears. That being said, it takes a while longer before any inkling of humanity comes up. Specifically, about 4.57 billion years ago, a supernova happens to occur. Nothing special. There are many thousands that year alone. Like all the others, it seeds the space near it with heavy metals, adds new elements and energy to an area already dense with interstellar gases, and within a few million years, this cloud of dust and heavy metal has laid the groundwork for new stars to be created. In this sort of stellar nursery, Now that cloud of gases starts to collapse in on itself, mostly hydrogen. The effects of gravity pull it together into many new stars, one of which is what we will now, several billion years from this, call the Sun. At this stage, it's still only a protostar, not ignited, but it draws more gas and dust into itself, or at least into its orbit, at quite a rate. Begins accreting hundreds or thousands of protoplanets around it in its orbit, even as it grows. Now, although it's not really a star yet exactly, it already gives off quite a lot of heat. Inside the frost line, which develops around it, which is the point where water starts to melt as it gets close to it, inside that line, water and certain other minerals don't condense, so the only protoplanets that exist inside of that line are made of the heavier metals, which are a lot rarer: iron, nickel, aluminum, lots of others. Outside of that line, it's the water, the methane ice, the hydrogen, the helium that form the cores of the planets. Right at the frost line comes the largest protoplanet, which one day becomes Jupiter. Now, as they accrete matter, the protoplanets begin to slow and pull into tighter orbits. They pretty much absorb or clear most of the loose gas and dust in the local area. And given another few tens of millions of years, the pressurized sphere of hydrogen at the center of the solar system achieves critical mass, temperature, and pressure, and begins fusing the hydrogen that it is composed of, mainly, and sparks to life. The Sun, therefore, enters the main sequence and becomes a star. Now, over the next 50 million years or so, a succession of collisions between the unstable protoplanets, not much helped by the gravitational influence of the growing gas and ice giants beyond the frost line, which screw things up quite a bit, rather sharply reduces the number of protoplanets. Via accretion, they combine, they're captured by moons, they're ejected from the solar system entirely on wild trajectories. This is what we call the early bombardment era, and it leaves only 8 planets standing. 4 made of heavy metal inside the frost line, 4 made of gas outside the frost line. There are a lot of dwarf planets and asteroids that survived the period as well, of course. Quite a few more than have survived to the present day, actually. It's hard to tell with the outer planets and Venus, considering we can't really see their surfaces per se. But the other 3 inner planets that we can see, their geography was defined to a great extent by these early years. Mercury lost most of its crust to a glancing impact with something very big, which left only a thin layer around its iron core, which is why it's so small and iron-rich. Mars took a hit hard enough to cause the Mars dichotomy, which is the fact, you can look this up easily, the northern hemisphere is several kilometers lower than the southern hemisphere on average, thanks to some impact. But what's relevant is the protoplanet Earth, which most likely, according to our current theories, was struck by the protoplanet we've dubbed Theia. In all likelihood, that was an ice core protoplanet flung inward from beyond the frost line by the growing giants' gravitational shenanigans. Theia and Earth fused, except for some debris which coalesced into the moon over the next few million years. This considerably increased Earth's mass. Theia was not actually that much smaller than the Earth, and likely it was the source for most of the Earth's water, along with a lot of smaller impacts by objects from beyond the frost line. Now, it took another 50 million years or so, but the Earth and the Moon slowly cooled from their insanely superheated post-collision temperatures until the sea of liquid magma finally started to cool into a solid iron crust. Now, there will have been a greenhouse effect. The atmosphere was very thin, carbon dioxide and methane mainly, though, and it's possible there could have been liquid water on Earth already at this point in melted areas, in areas that had solidified from the magma, but that's not a certainty, mainly because of what happened next, which is that just as the solar system seemed to be calming down, A fun gravitational resonance between Jupiter and Saturn saw Jupiter push Saturn and Neptune further out from the Sun, which in the process scattered most of the asteroid belt, now much smaller than it was in this early period. And this created the late heavy bombardment. The inner planets were battered with impactors disturbed by the giants. Not on the same scale as the earlier bombardment. These were mostly smaller, but most of Earth's newly solid rock was very rapidly liquefied again. And so it took, another 100 million years or so for the Earth to begin to cool back down. This time, for good. As it did, the mantle and core outgassed their stocks of water naturally, with the iron settling into the core. And by 4 billion years ago, the Earth was still a bit hot, but essentially covered in deep oceans of liquid water. Now, there was still rather vigorous volcanic activity, 3 times or more today's on average at least. And this was a good thing, actually, as it was slowly building up the first of what would become the continental crusts beneath the oceans. This begins the so-called Archean Eon. Now, that process continued for, a 250 million years or so, until about 3 3/4 billion years ago, not really so long after the Earth finally cooled down, the first life on Earth finally emerged. It's awe-inspiring, isn't it? Single-celled microbial... Now, this is not 100%, of course. Obviously, we're depending wholly on a mostly non-existent fossil record in our best educated guesswork. But anyway, probably these single-celled microbial mats called stromatolites. They fed on sulfates from undersea volcanoes, maybe sunlight with primitive photosynthesis, but the undersea volcano seems to be the more popular theory. And they slowly built up into reef-like structures. Now, this is not a CGI image. Stromatolites still exist and build these kind of structures. Now, the timing of all this is very imprecise. The first definite fossil record is from just under 3.5 billion years ago, but some scientists do think life could have existed for as much as 1 billion years before that. Now, how did we get this life? Well, they emerged from what we would call a primordial soup. Around those undersea volcanoes, there is energized, mineral-rich water, and random combinations of amino acids over the course of hundreds of millions of years create very primitive cell structures. This sounds a little wild, but it happened. It's actually demonstrable. You can replicate very similar conditions in a lab using nutrient-rich water, but no biological matter, obviously, along with a bit of electricity, as would have happened from lightning on Earth. This is called the Miller-Urey experiment, and it quite consistently leads to the creation of the complex amino acids that are needed for life. From there, it just takes a random combination or two, and you've got life. Now, the last universal common ancestor of all life on Earth, that is only slightly after this time. Probably one of the first creatures to have recognizable DNA or RNA. We started splitting off from bacteria quite a while ago. Now, it took another 500 million years, but it is, regardless of the exact dates of the emergence of life, there is no doubt, based on some of the most ancient fossils we've ever found, that by the time the first landmass broke the ocean surface, the supercontinent, as it was not so very creatively named. We'll get to later, though. By the time it broke the ocean surface, there was life on Earth already, although not on All of it was in the oceans. Now, by 3.2 billion years ago, was about 12% the size of the current continents and totally lifeless. But it did exist, and it was growing. Over the next 400 million years, the Mesoarchean era, cyanobacteria became the dominant form of life on Earth. They developed, multiplied, the Earth cooled and stabilized. The Earth was still, 55 Celsius or so on average, 130 Fahrenheit. Maybe more like 85 Celsius, according to some, which is 185 Fahrenheit. Short of boiling, but not comfortable for modern life. But it was slowly cooling over time. And the next 300 million years or so saw those spreading cyanobacteria reach a critical mass. Now, these had, the cyanobacteria did operate on photosynthesis. Probably they were one of the first creatures to do so, and that's probably why they became so dominant. However, there was a noteworthy side effect of that, which is that about 2.5 billion years ago, they reached a critical mass where their photosynthesis process began to saturate the oceans with oxygen. And these, about 2.5 billion years ago, the oceans reached their capacity for oxygen, and that oxygen began flowing into the atmosphere as well, slowly building that up. In the process, starting by about this time as they oxidated the oceans and continuing over the next 500 million years or so, the cyanobacteria, quite accidentally, and they were entirely incapable of premeditation, of course, but they pretty much wiped out all other life on Earth by accident, with the so-called Great Oxidation. Look, almost everything but the cyanobacteria. Now, the cyanobacteria, of course, produced oxygen as a byproduct of their photosynthesis. Pretty much everything else, however, had no use for oxygen, and much of it was very intolerant to oxygen, being quite anaerobic. Turns out using oxygen is better. A lot of the old stuff was poisoned by oxygen. Long story short, by about 2 billion years ago, the cyanobacteria had successfully poisoned or outcompeted pretty much every anaerobic organism on Earth, which was likely the vast majority of it. Now, even by this point, oxygen levels were only 10% of what they are in the modern day, but this was still enough to pretty well wipe out everything that wasn't a cyanobacteria. Now, the cyanobacteria didn't actually use the oxygen, they just produced it, but at least they weren't poisoned by it, so that's a win for them. That being said, there was some pretty intense evolutionary pressure in this period, and it did lead to a pretty big breakthrough, most likely. Because one of the leading theories for the origin of modern cell structure is that a moving anaerobic cell, capable of primitive self-propulsion, and an aerobic cyanobacteria sort of formed a symbiotic relationship and eventually merged or melded together to create eukaryotes. That is, if you remember your biology, which I barely do, to be honest, historian, but cells with a nucleus. The aerobic cell became the mitochondria, the anaerobic cell became the nucleus. This took many hundreds of millions of years to fully develop, of course, but nonetheless. Meanwhile, the continent building was steadily continuing. I've been running the same image this whole time, but at this point, there were already multiple significant above-water landforms, much smaller than the current continent still, but building pretty rapidly. So let's skip forward another, billion years. Now, these processes, the early development of life, the oxygenation of the planet, the development of the continents, they carried on pretty steadily through this billion years, which there's not much of a fossil record still for this period, unfortunately. But sometime in the second half of this billion years, there was a breakthrough: multicellular organisms. Now, these actually arise pretty easily. Likely, we think they arose independently on multiple different occasions and paths. If you have enough oxygen and resources, it's not that hard. Of course, how these early cells reproduced would have been asexually through cell division, but sometimes by accident during that process, they don't separate, and then you have two bonded together forever. Now, most of these, of course, would inevitably be disastrous horrors that would die immediately, but every once in a while one actually works. And when it does work, the ability of cells to share nutrients and provide mutual support is actually a great advantage if they use it right. And so the process began to accelerate, the cells began to specialize, and eventually the first organisms began to reproduce sexually instead of by cell division. Once they became multicellular, that was kind of necessary, especially once they started to specialize. Now, sexual reproduction is very imprecise, but that too is in most ways a benefit, because the potential of beneficial mutations went way up. So did the potential of non-beneficial mutations, but this is part of the reason why life exploded a lot after sexual reproduction came to be, and took 1.5 billion years before to get much of anywhere. That being said, there was a bit of a setback soon after, that being Snowball Earth. Now, the 500 million years after that did see a big split between immobile plants and mobile animals for the first time. Soon after that came the emergence of the first known herbivores dedicated to eating plants. Did not take long. Now, life was becoming more and more complex, but we'll never fully know to what extent, because it was set back pretty hard by the Snowball Earth. This was basically a runaway positive feedback loop. Ice and snow reflects solar energy rather than absorbing it. Therefore, the average temperature falls the more ice and snow you have. Therefore, there's more ice and snow. Therefore, more solar energy gets reflected. Therefore, the average temperature falls. Therefore, there's more ice and snow. And before you know it, you've frozen the whole planet, which causes, obviously, a pretty large extinction. This actually may have happened more than once, although every time it was massive volcanic activity which saved us by melting the Earth, injecting the atmosphere with a bunch of CO2, which raised global temperatures enough to break the cycle. This extinction or extinctions did wipe out most life, although it survived in ice-free patches, areas with clear ice. Probably the equator was never fully frozen over due to tidal factors and sunlight and so on, but it's very hard to be sure. This did probably delay the development of life a couple 100 million years, though. But soon after, we reached the Cambrian period, and this is when life on Earth finally got going in earnest. I've got a pretty standard setup here for these periods, which will be a map of the world on top, and a nice picture of some wildlife on the bottom while I talk about things. Those world maps will show the development of the continents. I'm not going to talk about that in extreme detail, but you can take a flip through yourself. So, when the final Snowball Earth period receded, what followed is what we call the Cambrian explosion. Also, of course, the name for the Cambrian period. Now, the surviving life after the Snowball Earth was pretty primitive, but it was still multicellular and sexual reproducing. And it did not take long. I mean, it took 50 million years or so for this to happen, don't get me wrong, but after the Snowball Earth melted, it really did not take long against the previous timescales we've been talking about for a veritable array of complex multicellular organisms to emerge, including the first animals which we would probably recognize. Trilobites, obviously we don't have them anymore, but most people probably have heard of them. Other arthropods, which those are the origination, or one of the first arthropods. Obviously, arthropods were fairly dominant in the Cambrian, and for a lot of the very early history of the Earth, before the reptiles. Obviously, they are still around in the form of spiders and scorpions and many others. Anyway, trilobites, arthropods, jellyfish, primitive fish. Not very advanced yet. I think they had backbones, though. I believe the first fish with backbones were emerging, yeah. It's probable that maybe life before this was a bit more complex than we give it credit for. But it's just that it's only here that the fossil record really begins. Probably because the arthropods developed hard exoskeletons about this time, which allows them to be preserved. And the fish and some others began to develop backbones, which gives them a much higher chance of being preserved as fossils as well. Soft-bodied things that existed before probably did not get preserved as well. In any case, that was followed by the Ordovician period, which saw the rapid diversification of life continue. We saw the emergence of jawed fish, sharks, which have not changed much since, to be honest with you. I mean, they're basically some of the biggest and nastiest early jawed fish, and, yeah, turns out it's evolutionarily pretty much perfect. Very simple plan, works great. No notes for the next 450 million years on sharks. Alongside that, critically, the first land-based plants. Simple things, very short, basic, primitive, and nonetheless, of course, enormously momentous. Equally momentous, arthropods, thanks to the protection of their hard shells and some very primitive, sort of lung-like structures, began to acquire a limited ability to move on to land themselves. Although only temporarily still at the time, but a specter of things to come, perhaps. Now, the Silurian period saw this explosion of life briefly take a big setback with one of our first mass extinctions, caused by one of two things, possibly a glaciation period, because as you can see, most of the land on Earth, this continent was called Gondwana, most of it was drifting pretty extremely south. Like a large portion of the land on Earth is under 40 degrees of latitude or something like that, which is going to make it cold, or possibly a gamma ray burst. Whatever the case, about 85% of species and 50% of genera were pretty much wiped out. Now, this did not stop the spread of life at all. As always, the hardiest creatures survived, and in fact, later in the period, 3 different types of arthropods began to settle the land permanently. Arachnids, which, yeah, you know what those are. Myriapods, which are centipedes and millipedes. And hexapods, the 6-legged, the true insects. These all became fully terrestrial, no further need to go back into the oceans, and they were joined by increasingly complex plants on which they fed, most notably ferns. Much like sharks, ferns have not changed much since the Silurian period. They just kind of work. Now, these ferns, as it happens, are spore-bearing, and in the following Devonian period, we saw those spores develop in slightly more advanced plants into proper seeds. And those seeds work pretty dang well, as it turns out. Those plants spread very rapidly across the Earth's surface and grew in size. By the end of the Devonian period, the Earth had its first great forests. Meanwhile, having started to move on to land, arthropods had to stay there, as it turns out, because fish were seriously outcompeting them in the oceans by this point. The level of biodiversity among fish was pretty crazy. At the top of the food chain, there were very large, bony, and armored fish. Some of them also had 4-lobed fins and were able to drag themselves onto land for short excursions, probably because it was very tempting to eat the plant life that was there, or possibly just to chase arthropods. Now, these fish, tetrapods, eventually became the first amphibians. They still had to return to land very frequently, or to water very frequently, but those lobed fins slowly became more and more leg-like until they could actually hunt and forage more functionally on land. Meanwhile, the spread of plant life and the lack of organisms able to break them down actually caused another extinction event, because the minerals and compounds being swept loose from the soil tended to cause anoxia events, that is, lack of oxygen, in river estuaries due to all the rot on the bottom, and that killed a lot of bottom-dwelling invertebrates. Now, soon after this, in the Carboniferous period, those tetrapods finally took the critical steps to make themselves, to take themselves from amphibian to reptile. They developed thick, scaly skin and thick, waterproof eggs. This skin and these eggs allowed them, in all of their forms, to hold in water, and therefore they didn't have to return to the water anymore. Now, these early reptiles were pretty much already lizard-like. Not the same exactly as modern lizards, but not too far off. That being said, this was the golden age of the land arthropods. The reptiles were not fully capable of competing yet. The great forests which dominated the earth, to be clear, the forests emerged, nothing broke them down yet, and so they just grew. They dominated the Earth's surface pretty much completely, except where the climate made it impossible. The oxygen levels, as a result, skyrocketed and were actually higher than present-day levels during the Carboniferous. And that supported the arthropods reaching rather immense sizes. Now, the vertebrate reptiles did start to proliferate, but particularly away from water and in the air, the invertebrates pretty much dominated the place. However, this began to change as the environment became more arid, and the rainforests finally collapsed. Potential reasons? Well, as you can see, the two great continents, called Gondwana and Euramerica, collided to form the single continent, Pangaea, which definitely changed the climate patterns. Or it's actually possible that we more or less drained so much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that we collapsed the plant life. Not we exactly, but the plants did. There wasn't enough animal life yet to make up the difference? Maybe. In any case, oxygen levels fell with the rainforests, and the very large arthropods died out. Now, the new supercontinent, Pangaea, had a huge arid interior. This lack of water tended to work for the reptiles and the essentially identical synapsids, which were basically just a subgroup of reptile at that point. And those would rise to become the dominant groups of the Permian period. The synapsids were mostly on top at this point. The therapsids would become the first animals to situate their legs under their body rather than to the sides, which actually helps considerably with efficiency. They were some of the first migratory animals across the deserts. The therapsids might have continued to sideline the reptiles proper, if not for what's called the Great Dying, or the Permian-Triassic extinction event, if you want to be less cool about it. This is the single worst mass extinction event ever to occur, at least that's well attested in the fossil record. Something like 90% of marine and 70% of land-based species died out. 80% of all genera, half of all families, which means, entire evolutionary chains being wiped out. The most likely culprit is the Siberian traps, which is a massive 2 million year long volcanic event in what's now Siberia in the north. This would have expelled absolutely enormous amounts of magma, multiplied the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by 5, raised global temperatures very significantly, acidified most of the oceans, which is why the death rate is even higher in the ocean than it is on land. Out of all the therapsids, only the cynodonts survived, which were small burrowers. It was the reptiles that came through best, and would become the major remaining land-based vertebrates, and therefore dominated the following era by default. The following era would be the Triassic. Now, the Triassic was hot and dry, and those of you who, well, this is the first era perhaps that's very familiar to the pop culture listener. It saw the rise of the famous dinosaurs, of course. That said, practically speaking, the dominant species of the Triassic were actually the Pseudosuchians. These are ancestors of crocodilians, but they had longer legs and could walk more properly on all fours. I believe that's one in the right side image there. Dinosaurs were on the fringes for most of the Triassic, but they did begin to diversify and develop themselves. The Cynodonts, meanwhile, were driven underground and had to become nocturnal to survive, and there they would evolve into what we now know as mammals. Underground, they needed better insulation, fur, better hearing, external ears, and more social cooperative behaviors. So, they gained ears, they gained fur, they gained sort of stronger family bonds. They began to give live birth and nurse them. Now, although the Pseudosuchians did dominate the start of the Triassic, towards the end of the period they were outcompeted by the dinosaurs more and more. Probably another volcanic event helped them along. And in the end, the dinosaurs did rise in earnest. And a quarter of the remaining time to the present is what we would call the Jurassic period. This was probably the peak era for the dinosaurs, really. They became the dominant large life forms on the planet. Pangaea began to break back up into Laurasia and Gondwana, although they were probably a little bit connected still for part of this period, but the planet cooled a little bit, but was still quite warm. There were no ice caps at this point. The forests grew pretty much right up to the poles. Although bony fish had driven the reptiles out of the sea in the first place, they actually began to return now and came to dominate the seas as well. Obviously, they never drove fish out entirely, but two separate groups of dinosaurs developed flight as well. More famous, the pterosaurs, because they have the stereotypical dinosaur look. But by late in the Jurassic, probably, certainly by early in the Cretaceous, their feathered competitors, known as the birds, were actually pretty much thoroughly beating them. Birds were mostly smaller than pterosaurs, but significantly less fragile. Those wing membranes on the pterosaurs actually make it almost impossible for them to fly in forests. They're very thin and fragile, and they're too big. Even the smaller ones, however, any obstacle collision... I mean, bird bones, of course, are fragile, but it was worse for pterosaurs. Any twig collision or anything could doom them utterly. As a result, the birds did have the better of them quite a bit. Now, about another 80 million years to be fair, the Cretaceous period. Gondwana and Laurasia drift further apart. They begin to break up themselves. Gondwana splits into what becomes South America, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, Arabia, and India. Laurasia splits into North America, Europe, and Asia. So the Atlantic Ocean begins to become a thing in earnest, along with, call it a pseudo... I wouldn't say there's exactly an Indian Ocean. It's the Tethys, the ancient ocean that doesn't really exist anymore. Although it's not that well distinct from the Pacific, but they're all connected, of course, nonetheless, anyway, but such as how it was. India, of course, was initially going south with Gondwana, but more or less reversed course, went back up to Laurasia on its separate plate, slammed into the New Asia, and created the Himalayas, although at quite a late date. Obviously, it wasn't even close to that yet by 130 million years ago. That's part of why the Himalayas are so young and new and tall. Sea levels were still very high. As much as a third of the modern continents were still submerged at this point, even though they were taking on something resembling their modern shapes. And the climate was still very warm, still no ice caps. Flowering plants started to emerge and would prove advantageous enough that in most areas they pretty much just supplanted previous plant types, although conifers held on in cold areas and the ancient ferns remain unimpressed. They need not flowers nor seeds. Now, having been at their peak in the Jurassic, pterosaurs pretty much declined. Yeah, they're still the stereotypical dinosaur. Birds were pretty much outcompeting them by the Cretaceous. Now, dinosaurs in general, the dominant creatures across the Earth, not changing that rapidly necessarily. Obviously, a lot of new species arose, but they had already achieved a lot of their archetypes by the end of the Jurassic. Now, the period, of course, ended pretty dramatically 66 million years ago with the most recent major mass extinction, probably caused by a massive asteroid impact in what's now the Yucatan Peninsula. 75% or more of all species died, partially the direct impact, partially the firestorms, partially the ocean acidification, mostly the ash, which considerably reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface for a decade or more. The only dinosaurs to survive were the birds, along with pretty much any other land-based vertebrate over 25 kilograms. Died, that is. Only small reptiles and mammals were left alive. The mammals had pretty much been small underground creatures for something like 100 million years now, but it's their golden chance. And sure enough, during the following 40 million years, they diversified immensely. Most of the modern families of mammals came into existence, including the first early primates. They emerged from the ground and they took their chance and exploded. Birds did become the sole ruler of the skies, and briefly they attempted to take the niche of the dinosaurs. Very large, flightless, feathered birds, very much birds, but very large, flightless, became alpha predators in some areas because it took a while for the mammals to grow up to the size where they could do so. But, well, the birds had handicapped themselves in that regard. They spent hundreds of millions of years developing hollow bones so that they could fly, and as it turns out, once the mammals got close to the size of the birds, size of the birds, well, hollow bones don't do well in a fight necessarily. Now, the Earth significantly cooled and dry, and so obviously those large flightless birds mainly went extinct, certainly the large predatory ones, with some exceptions. New Zealand. Although even the moa were not that predatory, I don't think. Yeah. Obviously there are herbivorous and, no, none of them are herbivorous, but there's small prey hunting large flightless birds still, but no large ones. No large prey hunting ones. So, the Earth cooled and dried quite a lot. Sea levels fell towards their present-day levels. The continents moved into something very close to their present configuration by the end of this. That continental movement itself was one of the causes of climate change. The continent configuration heavily impacts the climate. Things were breaking up, ocean currents quite different. Some of it was moving closer to the poles again. Grasses and herbs proliferated. Most of them didn't really exist before. The marginalized conifers were able to make quite a comeback in the cooler areas, and the rainforests were pushed back into equatorial regions. Now, almost the entire remaining time is what we would call the Neogene. Over the next 20 million years, the climate continued to cool. Mammals rapidly evolved towards their modern forms. Not, of course, the same as they are now, but by the end of the Neogene, 2.5 million years ago, most animals were pretty recognizable as ancestors of modern species. Now, this drying and cooling trend did cause North and South America to become connected towards the end of this period. That cut off critical warm water currents around the equator, which accelerated the cooling process quite a bit, actually. Now, relatively early in the Neogene, a group known as the hominids, the great apes, broke off from the other apes. Now, the other apes had already been distinguished by particular intelligence, even among the generally particularly intelligent primates. But the great apes were particularly intelligent, even for apes. And then from that group of great apes, 10 million or so years ago, the chimpanzees broke off and were particularly smart once again. And then around 6 million years ago, the forebears of humanity split off from the chimpanzees. It was about, numbers still very uncertain, this is all from the fossil record, but it was about 4.2 million years ago that the genus Australopithecus appeared as an offshoot of the great apes. Australopithecus was quite a smart lad. Brain only 35% the size of a modern human, but quite a smart lad nonetheless. Distinguished also by a high degree of bipedalism, perhaps more so than their intelligence. They were smart, but probably not necessarily smarter than chimps. What really distinguished them at this point was a high degree of bipedalism and hands which were well suited to grasping and fine manipulation. Now, apes are already capable of using tools to a basic extent. By about 3.4 million years ago, Australopithecus was well capable of using basic stone tools to forage for food. We have proof of that. But as I said, certain modern great apes also have pretty much the same ability to use basic stone tools. Australopithecus was probably a bit better at it already because of their hand shape, but there's still a long way to go to reach modern humans. That said, the famous skeleton known as Lucy was one of these Australopithecus. Now, the Quaternary period officially began 2.58 million years ago, and that is the period we are currently in. Until recently, it's been defined mainly by a series of glaciation periods, ice ages. These are pretty cyclical. Contrary to popular belief, they were never anything like a snowball Earth type thing. At their greatest extent, glaciers pretty much only reached 40 degrees of latitude or so at sea level, but rarely any further south or north, which pretty much just means only, well, the areas shown in white on this map, the northern reaches of North America and Europe, plus Asia, Siberia, only the southernmost portions of South America and Australia were actually ever covered in glaciers. Obviously, global temperatures did fall in general, as did sea levels, which is why the brown shows the ability to walk onto Indonesia and almost to walk onto Australia, among other things. North Sea filled in and so on. But, yes. The Ice Age is sometimes a little over-dramatized, suggesting a snowball Earth type thing. It was not anywhere near that bad. Most of the Earth was colder than we would think of today, but not literally frozen over. Obviously, there's some now very densely populated areas that were quite frozen at the time in Europe and North America, but humanity's forebears were very much still in Africa at the time of most of these. Not at the very end, but we'll get to that. So it was about 2.31 million years ago, not too long into the Quaternary, that the species known as Homo habilis broke off from the broader Australopithecus group. Homo habilis had a particularly big brain, especially the cerebrum, and it was probably the first of our ancestors to have handedness, as in right or left hand, which means their brain was lateralizing right and left hemispheres. Like the other great apes, Homo habilis started out in Africa. However, they probably already started our human tradition of expansion and made their way out of Africa at least a little bit. It didn't necessarily last and wasn't on a huge scale, but they were probably wanderers more than other ape species. Now, it was about 2 million years ago that we saw the appearance of Homo erectus. Now, this is a very definite ancestor of humans. As its name implies, Homo erectus walked almost totally upright, which even habilis would have sometimes walked on all fours, but Homo erectus pretty much walked totally upright, lived on the plains instead of in forests. Its brain by this point was probably 75% the size of modern humans, especially in later examples. They also had less sexual dimorphism than other apes. Obviously, humans still have sexual dimorphism, and it's pretty obvious to us. But if ours is, well, these are, I don't feel competent to give a wild ballpark number on this, but suffice to say, other great apes have significantly more sexual dimorphism than humans do. And this probably contributed to Homo erectus being potentially somewhat monogamous. Of course, many apes are polygynous, with the alpha mating with all the females or whatever. Homo erectus may have been the first ancestor to be partially monogamous or trended that way. They also started to lose the full coating of body hair that other apes possessed in order to make endurance movement on the plains more efficient. Now, of course, these changes were not instant. They took place slowly and largely independently over 1.5 million years or so. The basic elements were in place by the time we can recognize the existence of the species 2 million years ago, but it changed significantly over the next 1.5 million years. Now, it was Homo erectus that became the first species to master the creation and control of fire for its own purposes, cooking mainly. It also developed specifically crafted stone tools for various purposes. And maybe the most critical indicator, Homo erectus was not a scavenger. It was an apex predator that could hunt large mammals like bovines and pachyderms using stone tools. Now, this species definitely spread not only throughout Africa, but into Europe and southern Asia, outcompeted and wiped out numerous other great ape species on the way. It wasn't until 300,000 years ago, roughly, a real blink of an eye by geological standards, that archaeologists would say that Homo sapiens finally came to be. An offshoot of Homo erectus. Not, of course, it's not like you snap your fingers and it's all Homo sapiens now, or like this kid is Homo sapiens and its father's Homo erectus, but the change happens. It's an offshoot that establishes itself in Africa, alongside numerous other Homo species and offshoots descended from the erectus, the most famous of which are the Neanderthals, but there are others, Denisovans, and still more than that. This is not really surprising. Homo erectus is an apex predator population, which managed to spread itself to multiple continents, many environments, over a period of more than 1 million years. But it still only moved at walking pace, and probably not without specific need. So these populations, which did spread out, were very geographically isolated from each other, and it's no surprise that over hundreds of thousands of years they diverged into potentially dozens of sort of human-like species. Compared to the other archaic Homo species, Homo sapiens is actually pretty fragile, but has an exceptionally large brain. Now, this Homo sapiens of 300,000 years ago is maybe not quite identical to us yet, but it's pretty close already. It's very likely that if you could time travel to 300,000 years ago, grab a Homo sapiens infant, take it back, drop it in a maternity ward, swap it with a human baby from now, maybe, probably no one would ever notice the difference. It's close enough at this point to a modern human to be fully functional that way. Homo sapiens was able to make advanced tools, spears, throwing spears, And, perhaps more importantly for brain development, by this time already was making the first art, including figurative art, and there's evidence of proto-religious behavior and complex communication skills. These Homo sapiens began to develop proto-languages. Now, of course, everything is at best oral tradition, and there's not even really an oral tradition yet, because proto-languages at best. And so it takes a long time for anything remotely resembling a society to develop, as in several 100,000 years. Because for the most part, progress is just lost with every generation, if any's made. But over the next 150,000 years thereafter, Homo sapiens pretty much manages to displace or absorb most of the other Homo species in Africa, and starts to spread into parts of Europe and Asia, just like Homo erectus before it. Other Homo species were pretty much outcompeted, either killed, absorbed through interbreeding, bit of both. By 150,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had begun to create and wear clothing, had learned to fish. And by 100,000 years ago, it had created the first known deliberate structures, which now consist just of heavily eroded circles of stone blocks, but were definitely built deliberately. Although this photo is terrible, I've been unable to find a better one of this archaeological site. My apologies. Now, you might have noticed some dates on the last image that didn't line up with what I was saying, and that is because of this. 74,000 years ago, just as Homo sapiens seemed set to dominate the world, the Toba supervolcano blew its top. And this probably almost drove us to extinction. Now, this is a little disputed, but the most common interpretation that I've found is that the human population was reduced, most of it in Asia, in Europe. The more tenuous and sparsely populated areas was pretty much wiped out. Probably the only Homo sapiens that survived were in Africa, which pretty much undid 150, 200,000 years of expansion in an instant, and probably only a few thousand of them. Now, this is definitely disputed. Some argue that it was some kind of evolutionary breakthrough and replacement event that happened instead. Here's the fact, though. All modern humans, based on DNA evidence, descend from a couple of thousand of Homo sapiens individuals that formed a single breeding population only about 70,000 years ago, which is why humans have never come anywhere near diverging into multiple species again, because it just takes way longer than that for that kind of thing to happen. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, with our breeding times particularly. And we were one population as recently as 70,000 years ago. And honestly, arguably, we pretty much are again with the ease of modern transport, and have been for several thousand years already, practically. Well, not the Americas, but yeah. Anyway, the point is, about 75,000 years ago, most other archaic human species were pretty much wiped out, probably due to the Toba supervolcano. And Homo sapiens went through a severe genetic bottleneck because of this, because of something else. In any case, it happened, which is the reason Homo sapiens is so standardized. Those few thousand individuals are the direct ancestors of every modern human, and they were all interbreeding, all very similar to each other, so are we now. In any case, after the Toba supervolcano finally began to fade, we once again expanded out of Africa, rebounded. Now, there were only, as far as we can tell, 2 other Homo species that survived the eruption, or whatever else happened. The Neanderthals and the Denisovans, the Neanderthals being mainly in Europe and the Denisovans in sort of Indonesia. We rather thoroughly outcompeted them. Some combination, I mean, obviously there's no real direct evidence, very limited for what happened, but some combination of violence and interbreeding pretty much pushed those species out of existence. There is definitely some evidence for interbreeding having happened, but it's very likely violence happened as well. The DNA proves that there was some interbreeding, though. practically all modern humans have a little bit of DNA from one of them, although mostly it just doesn't do anything anymore. It just sits there, being in the genetic code, but inactive because it's not compatible fully. But anyway, by about 40,000 years ago, the combination of climate change, disease, and being generally outcompeted, killed by, absorbed into the Homo sapiens population led to the complete extinction of the Neanderthals soon after the Denisovans, and Homo sapiens became the only species left of its genus, the only Homo species, and the unchallenged apex predator, well, among the apes and frankly of the world. Not coincidentally at all, the Quaternary extinction began about this time and pretty much carried on to about 10,000 years ago. Many of the famous megafauna, the mammoths, the ground sloths, the saber-toothed tigers, the cave bears, and so on, were driven extinct. Some of this is because the most recent ice age came to a close. Some of this is because humans wiped them out. Cave bears, for instance, competed with humans for caves. They probably lost that fight, although they were very large, but they didn't have stone tools or teamwork. They probably lost that fight. Others, like mammoths, ground sloths, probably just too easy for spear-armed humans to hunt, potentially. Even though they're also quite large, but... In any case, about 25,000 years ago, as the last ice age reached its climax, humans crossed into America via a land bridge over the Bering Strait thanks to the ice. We were fairly advanced already by this time. Humans had started to use flax, jute, hemp, cotton, other natural fibers to create not just clothes, but also baby carriers. Probably the very first thing of this type, actually. Baby carriers. Very, very useful. Bags. Baskets. Nets. Whatever else we needed for ourselves that we could make out of natural fibers. Now, the Ice Age didn't last forever. After we crossed over to the Americas and settled them, well, the last great ice sheets entered a terminal melting period and began what we call the Holocene Epoch, about 11,700 years ago. Now, by the end of this time, humans had already advanced the process of domesticating dogs, pigs, sheep, and goats, enough to be identifiable by their remains in our campsites, including, as much as 11,700 years ago, the oldest known cases of dogs being buried with their owners, which honestly can hardly fail to bring a tear to your eye. Man's best friend indeed. It's an old bond. So, about 9,000 years ago, humans began selectively breeding barley and wheat in northern Mesopotamia. Now, we were still very much migratory at that point, living as hunter-gatherers, but we began to deliberately collect barley and wheat seeds, sow them in known locations, and then return every year to harvest them, probably using them for beer. Powerful motivator, apparently. Congratulations, even our ancestors were alcoholics. But also for gruel and food, obviously. Partially a joke about... It's not a joke about beer. We definitely used it for beer, but also for food. It would be very human indeed if it was mostly for the beer, but a bit of both. Anyway, also around this time, the first evidence for domestication of cattle and the cat. The latter definitely not coincidental, because what's the main use humans have for humans? Protecting their crops from rodents. Didn't need cats before we had crops. Now we have crops, we need cats. This is also about the same time at which all humans living then were ancestors of all humans now living. Called the identical ancestors point. Probably, maybe slightly earlier, right about the time the Bering Strait would have separated, of course. Now, by this point, the worldwide human population had been steadily rising for thousands of years, had probably exceeded 1 million humans already for the first time ever, and it would never fall below 1 million again. In fact, from this point on, the human population would decrease only on exceptionally rare occasions. Mostly, well, two in particular, spoilers, but at the similarly timed collapses of the Han and Roman empires, which caused a lot of turmoil, and then when the Black Death struck humanity. That being said, growth 9,000 years ago was extremely slow, and having reached 1 million, it would take more than another 8,000 years to reach 100 million. Well, no, 7,000 years, I think. I believe it passed 100 million during the peak of the Han and Roman empires. In any case, it was only about 7,500 years ago, aka at this point we can put it as 5,500 BCE, that early proto-writing started to emerge. Simple symbols and ideograms to communicate concepts. This isn't really a language. Think of it as road signs, bathroom signs, peace symbols. Those are ideograms, conceptually very similar to what the first writing was. There was no alphabet, there was not really an organized system, no way to communicate a whole language, but nonetheless they were very valuable, as we can attest from the examples I just cited, road signs, symbols, etc. Also around this time, humans began smelting copper to use for tools, probably the first metal that we used in significant quantities. So it was about 6,000 years ago, call it 4,000 BCE, that humanity finally began to settle down, with agriculture developing to such a degree that it was possible for us to grow enough crops to abandon the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and perhaps necessary because those crops helped our population grow beyond what hunter-gathering could support. And as a result, permanent settlements began popping up for the first time, first in Mesopotamia, then in Egypt, then in surrounding areas. Now this is still not the start of recorded history. Writing was at best in its infancy. This early civilization is only attested to by archaeology still. But it does mark the beginning of settled human civilization. From this point, the beginnings of proper recorded history are only a short leap away. So join me next time for the early years of human civilization, starting from about 4,000 BCE. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and have a nice millennia.